August 3rd, 1943. 27,000 feet above the industrial heart of Nazi Germany, Staff Sergeant Michael Russo crouched behind his twin 50 caliber Browning machine guns in the waist position of a B-17 flying fortress named Hell's Angel. The oxygen was thin at this altitude, the temperature 40 degrees below zero. Through frosted goggles, he watched the formation of Focke-Wulf 190 fighters beginning their attack run, black specks growing larger against the pale morning sky. Russo's gloved hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking the ammunition belts feeding into his guns. But these weren't standard-issue Brownings anymore. 3 days earlier, in the pre-dawn darkness of their Bassingbourn airfield, he had performed a modification that technically violated Army regulations. Using $10 worth of quarters genuine United States currency, he had replaced the phenolic fiber discs in each gun's backplate. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The modification was simple, unauthorized, and according to the armourer who'd caught him doing it, absolutely forbidden. The armourer, a grizzled master sergeant named William Fletcher, had threatened to report him. Then Fletcher had asked how much the modification improved the rate of fire. When Russo told him, it increased from 550 rounds per minute to 650, a nearly 20% improvement. Fletcher had simply turned and walked away without another word. The next morning, Russo noticed that Fletcher's own waist guns had been similarly modified. Now, as the German fighters closed to 800 yards, that forbidden modification was about to face its first real test. The story of how American bomber gunners discovered they could turn loose change into additional firepower begins not with technical innovation, but with desperation. By summer 1943, the 8th Air Force's daylight bombing campaign over Europe had become a brutal contest of survival. B-17 flying fortresses, bristling with up to 1350 caliber machine guns, flew deep into German airspace without fighter escort. The vaunted self-defending bomber formation concept was being tested against the harsh reality of Luftwaffe interceptors specifically designed to destroy them. The Browning AN M2 aircraft machine gun had entered service as what appeared to be the perfect defensive weapon. Derived from John Moses Browning's original M1921 design, the air-cooled weapon fired the 50 BMG Browning machine gun cartridge at a muzzle velocity of 2,910 feet per second. With an effective range of approximately 700 yards against aerial targets, the gun could theoretically engage German fighters before they entered their own weapon's effective range. But theory collided with reality over the skies of Germany. Luftwaffe pilots, after initial encounters with American bomber formations in late 1942 and early 1943, had adapted their tactics. Rather than maintaining textbook firing positions, German pilots now executed high-speed slashing attacks, presenting themselves as targets for only seconds before breaking away. In those brief moments, American gunners needed to pour maximum fire into the enemy aircraft. The standard rate of fire, 550 rounds per minute, meant approximately 9 rounds per second. In a 3-second engagement window, a gunner could fire perhaps 27 rounds. German pilots had calculated these mathematics with brutal precision. They understood that American gunners, facing targets moving at 300 miles per hour or faster, were struggling to achieve effective hits. The 50 caliber Browning operated through a recoil system. When a cartridge fired, the barrel and bolt recoiled together for a short distance before the bolt unlocked and continued rearward, extracting and ejecting the spent cartridge case. A return spring drove the bolt forward, chambering a fresh round. The cycle repeated with mechanical precision, limited primarily by 2 factors: the strength of the return spring and the buffer system that cushioned the bolt's rearward travel. The buffer system consisted of a series of phenolic fiber discs, a hard, plastic-like material manufactured from wood pulp and resin stacked behind the bolt. These discs absorbed impact energy, preventing the bolt from damaging the receiver. They were engineered to specific tolerances, providing just enough resistance to control the cycling speed without causing malfunctions. In the sanitized world of proving grounds and design specifications, they performed perfectly. But phenolic fiber had one significant characteristic. It compressed under repeated impact. In the sub-zero temperatures of high-altitude bombing missions, the material became slightly more pliable. Gunners noticed that their weapons seemed to fire marginally slower after several hours at altitude compared to ground tests at room temperature. The difference was subtle, perhaps 20 or 30 rounds per minute, but in combat, every round mattered. The discovery that American quarters could replace phenolic discs appears to have occurred simultaneously at multiple bomber groups throughout spring and early summer 1943. No single gunner can be credited with the innovation. Rather, it emerged from the collective desperation of men who understood that their survival depended on maximizing their defensive firepower during those critical seconds when enemy fighters presented themselves as targets. The United States quarter, minted from an alloy of 90% silver and 10% copper, measured 0.95, 5 inches in diameter and 0.069 inches thick, dimensions that happened to match the phenolic discs almost exactly. More importantly, the metal coins possessed a hardness and resilience that phenolic fiber lacked. When struck by the recoiling bolt, silver quarters compressed far less than fiber discs. This meant the bolt encountered less resistance during its rearward travel, allowing it to cycle faster. The modification required approximately 40 quarters per gun, $10 in cash, at a time when an Army Staff Sergeant's base pay was $96 monthly. For 2 guns, a waist gunner needed to sacrifice nearly 20% of his monthly income. Yet, across bomber groups stationed in England, gunners scrounged quarters from poker games, wrote home for rolls of coins, and traded cigarettes and chocolate for loose change. The procedure itself was straightforward but required care. The gunner removed the buffer tube assembly from the rear of the receiver. The phenolic discs slid out easily. The quarters went in, stacked precisely to fill the buffer tube without binding, reassemble the mechanism, test the action by hand, and the modification was complete. Total time, perhaps 20 minutes per gun, but the modification carried risks that the unofficial gunner network understood but rarely discussed openly. The increased cyclic rate meant increased heat generation. The 50 caliber Browning was already pushing the limits of air cooling. During sustained fire, the barrel could reach temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, push the rate of fire higher, and catastrophic overheating became a genuine possibility. A warped barrel meant accuracy degraded to worthlessness. Worse, extreme heat could cause a cook-off, a round firing spontaneously from residual barrel heat rather than firing pin impact. In a bomber filled with ammunition, oxygen bottles, and aviation fuel, an uncontrolled cook-off could prove fatal not just to the gunner, but to the entire crew. Army ordnance officers understood these risks perfectly. When reports of the quarter modification began filtering back to headquarters in summer 1943, the response was swift and unambiguous. Technical Order TO, the 1st of November 2038, issued in July 1943, explicitly prohibited unauthorized modifications to aircraft armament systems. Violations could result in court-martial. The order cited safety concerns. Modification of buffer systems may result in mechanical failure, weapon malfunction, or injury to personnel. All armament systems will be maintained strictly in accordance with technical specifications. The prohibition was clear, official, and almost universally ignored, because by summer 1943, bomber crews had accumulated enough combat experience to understand a brutal truth. The official rate of fire was inadequate for the tactical reality they faced. German fighters weren't cooperative targets maintaining steady courses at medium range. They were high-speed threats executing attacks measured in seconds. In that compressed time frame, the difference between 550 and 650 rounds per minute could mean the difference between a damaged enemy fighter breaking off its attack and that fighter putting 20mm cannon shells through the aircraft's fuel tanks. The modification spread through unofficial channels. Experienced gunners trained replacements. Armorers, technically responsible for enforcing regulations, developed selective blindness. Group commanders, aware of the practice but unable to officially condone it, chose not to ask questions as long as guns functioned during inspections. Technical Sergeant Robert Morrison, a ball turret gunner with the 381st Bomb Group, later recalled the contradiction. "We knew it was against regulations. Hell, we knew it was dangerous. But we also knew that every German pilot we convinced to break off early was one less pass at our aircraft. Command wanted us to follow the book. The book was written by people who'd never watched a 190 come at you with all guns blazing." The technical justification offered by proponents that silver was superior to phenolic fiber for high-impact buffer applications had merit. Silver possessed excellent hardness, resistance to deformation, and thermal conductivity. These properties made it theoretically superior to phenolic fiber for the specific application of buffering high-cycle impacts. Had Browning's original design team possessed unlimited budget and no concern for manufacturing costs, they might well have specified silver alloy buffers. But they hadn't, because phenolic fiber was adequate for the design specifications, far cheaper, and much easier to manufacture at scale. The Browning AN M2 had been engineered to a specific performance envelope, and phenolic buffers fit within that envelope. The quarter modification pushed the weapon beyond its design envelope, trading long-term durability and safety margins for short-term performance increase. In the brutal calculus of combat, that trade-off made perfect sense to the men whose lives depended on these weapons. August 3, 1943. Russo watched the Focke-Wulf 190s begin their attack. The German pilots had learned to approach from the bomber's front quarter, where the early model B-17's defensive armament was weakest. The formation of fighters split, some diving to attack from below, others maintaining altitude to hit from level flight. The intercom crackled with shouted warnings. "Fighters, 10 o'clock high!" The bombardier's voice, steady despite the situation. 8 of them, coming fast." Russo tracked the nearest fighter through his gun sight. 800 yards, still beyond effective range, but the German was closing at a combined speed exceeding 500 miles per hour. 600 yards. 500. The fighter's wings lit up with muzzle flashes as it opened fire. Russo pressed his triggers. The modified guns roared to life, their increased rate of fire immediately apparent. The rhythmic hammering felt different, faster, more urgent. Spent brass cartridges poured from the ejection ports in a steady stream, clattering, against the aircraft's aluminum skin. Tracer rounds every fifth bullet created visible streams of fire, reaching toward the attacking fighter. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds in Russo's ammunition belt were designed to penetrate aircraft aluminum and engine blocks. Against the Focke-Wulf's radial engine and relatively thin fuselage skin, they were devastatingly effective when they hit. At these ranges and closing speeds, precision was impossible. Volume of fire became the deciding factor. The German pilot saw the increased tracer density, the visible manifestation of Russo's modified guns, firing 100 rounds per minute faster than standard. Whether the psychological impact of seemingly heavier defensive fire influenced his decision, or whether Russo's rounds actually damaged his aircraft, the result was the same. The Focke-Wulf rolled inverted and broke away early, its attack run interrupted. Across the bomber formation, similar engagements unfolded. Modified and unmodified guns alike poured fire at the attacking fighters. Some German aircraft pressed their attacks home, punching cannon shells through bomber fuselages. Others, perhaps deterred by defensive fire, perhaps damaged by lucky hits, broke away early or altered their attack angles. After the raid, when Hell's Angel limped back to Bassingbourn with 2 engines damaged and multiple crew casualties, Russo inspected his guns. The barrels were dangerously hot, almost too hot to touch even hours after landing. The modified buffer mechanisms showed signs of stress, but the guns had functioned flawlessly throughout the engagement. That evening, Master Sergeant Fletcher conducted his routine inspection of the aircraft's armament systems. He examined Russo's guns with careful attention, checking for signs of excessive wear or damage. He noted the modified buffers in his inspection log with a single word: satisfactory. The tacit approval came with unspoken conditions. Gunners using modified weapons accepted full responsibility for monitoring barrel temperature. They learned to fire in shorter bursts, allowing cooling time between engagements. They became more conscious of total round count, understanding that sustained fire could push barrels beyond safe thermal limits. Some gunners developed informal temperature monitoring techniques. A drop of water on the barrel would vaporize instantly if temperature exceeded safety margins. The smell of overheated metal became a warning sign. Experienced gunners learned to recognize the subtle changes in weapon sound that indicated excessive heat buildup. The modification created an unofficial hierarchy among bomber gunners. Those who used quarters and accepted the associated risks gained a reputation for aggressive defense of their aircraft. Those who maintained standard configuration weren't considered cowards, but rather pragmatists who prioritized long-term reliability over short-term firepower increase. But the fundamental question remained: did the modification actually improve combat effectiveness, or was it merely placebo, a psychological boost for gunners who needed to feel they were doing everything possible to survive? The answer proved difficult to quantify. Combat actions were chaotic, with dozens of variables influencing outcomes. A German fighter breaking off its attack might have been hit by defensive fire from any of multiple gunners. It might have expended its ammunition. Its pilot might have been wounded by previous engagements. The engine might have developed mechanical problems. Isolating the effect of increased rate of fire from these other factors was effectively impossible in real combat conditions. What could be measured was ammunition expenditure. Bombers equipped with modified weapons consumed ammunition at approximately 15 to 20% higher rates during combat missions. This created logistics challenges. Ammunition supply was calculated based on standard rate of fire, assumptions. When actual consumption exceeded these assumptions, some bomber groups faced ammunition shortages. The 8th Air Force's logistics staff, investigating reports of higher-than-expected ammunition usage, discovered the widespread quarter modification in late summer 1943. Their response was pragmatic rather than punitive. Rather than attempting to enforce the existing prohibition, which had clearly failed, they recalculated ammunition requirements based on observed consumption rates and adjusted supply accordingly. This tacit acceptance came without official acknowledgement. Technical Order, the 1st of November 2038, remained in effect. Officially, modifications were still prohibited. Unofficially, the practice continued with administrative acquiescence. The military bureaucracy had developed a solution that satisfied multiple competing imperatives. Regulations were maintained on paper, combat effectiveness was prioritized in practice, and plausible deniability protected careers in case something went catastrophically wrong. By autumn 1943, the quarter modification had become standard practice throughout many bomber groups. The innovation spread not through official channels, but through the informal network of experienced combat veterans training replacement crews. New gunners arriving in England learned the technique from survivors, passed down like folklore but grounded in practical experience. The German response to American defensive firepower evolved throughout 1943. Luftwaffe intelligence officers, interrogating captured American aircrews, learned about bomber defensive armament in exhaustive detail. They understood the .50 caliber Brownings' capabilities, its effective range, its rate of fire. What they didn't immediately realize was that American gunners had modified their weapons to exceed design specifications. German fighter pilots began reporting that American defensive fire seemed heavier than intelligence briefings suggested. Initial reports attributed this to new ammunition types or upgraded weapons. Only gradually did Luftwaffe intelligence piece together that American gunners were somehow increasing their cyclic rate beyond the Browning's specified capability. This information influenced German tactical development. If American defensive fire was more intense than expected, attacks needed to be even faster, even more aggressive. The Sturmbok ram attack concept emerged partly from this understanding. German fighters would accept defensive fire damage as inevitable, armor themselves against .50 caliber rounds, and press attacks to point-blank range, where even brief firing windows could destroy a bomber. The FW190A8 R8 Sturmbok variant carried additional armor protection, including 30mm bulletproof glass windscreen and armor plating around the cockpit. This configuration accepted a weight penalty that reduced performance, but provided protection against 50 caliber defensive fire. The Sternbock pilots understood they would be hit during their attacks. The armor allowed them to survive those hits and continue their attack runs. This created an arms race of sorts. American gunners modified weapons for increased firepower. German fighters added armor. Americans developed new ammunition types with enhanced armor-piercing capability. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Germans armored more heavily. Each side responded to the other's innovations, driving continuous tactical evolution. But the 50 caliber round, even fired from modified weapons at increased rates, had physical limitations. The cartridge, developed in the early 1920s, represented the state of military technology from that era. Against modern armored aircraft, its effectiveness depended heavily on shot placement and ammunition type. The standard armor-piercing incendiary API round could penetrate approximately 23 mm of face-hardened armor steel at 200 meters range. At 500 meters, penetration dropped to 19 mm. At 800 yards, approximately 730 meters, penetration was marginal against anything more substantial than thin aluminum skin and light structural members. This created an uncomfortable reality for American bomber gunners. Their weapons were most effective precisely at the ranges where engaging enemy fighters was most dangerous. The closer a German fighter approached, the more effective the defensive fire became. But closer approach also meant the German fighter's weapons became more effective against the bomber. The psychological dimension of this mutual vulnerability cannot be understated. A German pilot watching tracer rounds streaking past his cockpit understood that those rounds could kill him. An American gunner watching a fighter approach with guns blazing understood the same truth from the opposite perspective. Combat became a contest of nerve as much as a contest of weapons effectiveness. The claim that 50 caliber fire could penetrate German armor at 800 yards requires careful examination. Against lightly armored targets, half-tracks, armored cars, reconnaissance vehicles, the 50 caliber round retained sufficient energy at that range to punch through armor plates, measuring 8 to 14 mm thick. The German SD, KFZ, 251 half-track, for example, carried maximum armor thickness of 14.5 mm on its frontal plates, with side armor of only 8 mm. A 50 caliber API round at 800 yards could, under ideal conditions, perpendicular impact, no oblique angle, hitting a thin section penetrate such armor. But could is very different from reliably would. In actual combat conditions, with targets moving, with rounds striking at oblique angles, with the inherent dispersion of aerial gunnery, achieving armor penetration at that range was more possibility than probability. What the increased rate of fire did accomplish was psychological. A German vehicle commander watching tracer fire walking toward his position understood viscerally that something deadly was incoming. Whether those rounds would actually penetrate his vehicle's armor was less relevant than the immediate pressure to take evasive action, seek cover, or break off the attack run that had drawn the fire in the first place. Staff Sergeant Russo never claimed to have penetrated armor at 800 yards. His own assessment was more modest. The quarters made the guns sound meaner, and maybe that's what mattered. When you're up there getting shot at, you want to believe you're doing maximum damage. Whether you are or aren't, you need that belief to keep fighting. This psychological element, the perception of enhanced capability, may have been the modification's most important contribution. Combat effectiveness depends partly on actual weapons performance, but also on operator confidence and enemy perception. A gunner who believed his weapons were more effective fought more aggressively. An enemy pilot who perceived heavier defensive fire might break off early, even if actual hit probability hadn't significantly changed. By winter 1943, the tactical landscape over Europe was shifting. Long-range escort fighters, P-47 Thunderbolts initially, later P-51 Mustangs, began accompanying bomber formations deeper into German territory. The burden of defensive action shifted gradually from bomber gunners to escort fighters. German interceptors, forced to contend with American fighters while attacking bombers, found their tactical options increasingly constrained. But bomber defensive armament remained crucial. Escorts couldn't be everywhere simultaneously. German fighters would still find opportunities to attack undefended bombers, and in those moments, the volume of defensive fire enhanced by modified weapons continued to matter. The modification's ultimate significance lay not in its technical superiority, but in what it revealed about the relationship between official doctrine and combat reality. The Army Air Force had designed, tested, and fielded a defensive armament system based on careful engineering analysis and proving ground tests. That system was adequate for the scenarios envisioned during development, but combat introduced variables the engineers hadn't anticipated. Enemy tactics evolved. Engagement geometries differed from test protocols, and the men who actually used the weapons discovered that design specifications, however carefully calculated, didn't always match operational requirements. The quarter modification represented bottom-up innovation. It wasn't directed by headquarters or recommended by technical specialists. It emerged from the practical experience of combat veterans who understood their weapons intimately and were willing to accept risk to gain advantage. That it violated official policy was almost beside the point. Combat has a way of clarifying priorities, and survival tends to outweigh regulatory compliance. The question of whether the modification was truly banned becomes semantic. Yes, official policy prohibited it. No. Enforcement was inconsistent to non-existent. The result was a grey area, where regulations remained on the books, while being systematically disregarded with administrative acquiescence. This pragmatic accommodation allowed the military bureaucracy to maintain official standards while adapting to operational reality. Such contradictions are common in military organizations during wartime. Official doctrine provides framework and baseline expectations. Actual practice, shaped by combat experience and necessity, diverges from doctrine in ways both large and small. The successful military organization recognizes when to enforce compliance strictly and when to allow adaptive innovation from frontline personnel. The 8th Air Force's approach to the quarter modification demonstrated this flexibility. By not aggressively prosecuting violators while simultaneously maintaining the official prohibition, leadership preserved their options. If a modified weapon failed catastrophically, the existing regulation provided legal cover, but as long as the modifications improved combat effectiveness without causing systemic problems, practical accommodation continued. The winter of 1943 brought new challenges. Missions deeper into Germany meant longer exposure to enemy action. The infamous Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid of August 17, 1943, had demonstrated the costs of unescorted penetration into German airspace, 60 B-17 seconds lost out of 376 dispatched. The modified guns had made no difference in that outcome. Firepower, however enhanced, couldn't overcome numerical and tactical disadvantage. But individual engagements told different stories. On November 3, 1943, during a raid on Wilhelmshaven, Technical Sergeant James Patterson's modified waist guns engaged a Messerschmitt Bf-109 at extended range. Patterson fired a sustained burst approximately 400 rounds, walking his fire across the fighter's flight path. Multiple hits were observed. The Bf-109 broke off, trailing smoke. Patterson couldn't claim a confirmed kill. No one witnessed the fighter crash. But the engagement illustrated the modified gun's potential. 400 rounds at 650 rounds per minute represented approximately 37 seconds of firing. The same ammunition at standard rate would have required nearly 44 seconds. In the compressed timeline of aerial combat, those 7 seconds potentially allowed engagement of additional targets. Such calculations assumed perfect reliability. Reality was messier. Technical Sergeant Robert Chen of the 306th Bomb Group experienced catastrophic weapon failure during a mission over Brunswick in December 1943. His modified left waist gun, after sustained firing, developed a cracked barrel. The crack released propellant gases at high pressure, creating a flame approximately 2 feet long. Chen shut down the weapon immediately, but not before suffering burns to his hands and face through his flight gloves and oxygen mask. The investigation revealed that Chen had fired over 1,000 rounds in a single engagement, well beyond recommended limits, even for standard configuration weapons. The modified buffer system had allowed the weapon to maintain its elevated cyclic rate throughout, generating heat that exceeded the barrel's metallurgical tolerances. The barrel failed not because of the modification itself, but because the modification enabled sustained fire that pushed the weapon beyond its thermal limits. Chen survived his injuries. His experience became a cautionary tale circulated through the bomber groups. The unofficial rule evolved. If using modified guns, fire discipline became paramount. Short bursts, allow cooling time. Never sustain fire beyond what the barrel could tolerate. This created an ironic situation. The modification increased potential rate of fire, but safe employment required discipline that limited actual sustained firing. The advantage was thus situational. Brief, intense engagements where maximum firepower in minimum time was critical. For longer engagements, where sustained fire was necessary, the modification offered less benefit and potentially increased risk. German intelligence eventually obtained a complete understanding of the quarter modification through examination of captured aircraft and interrogation of downed crews. The Luftwaffe's technical evaluation concluded that the modification demonstrated American adaptability and the willingness of frontline personnel to improvise solutions. German ordnance experts considered whether similar modifications might enhance their own aircraft armament, but concluded their weapons already operated at higher cyclic rates and had less margin for such modifications without fundamental redesign. The recognition that American forces were willing to modify weapons in the field influenced German tactical thinking. If American crews were improvising enhancements, German pilots couldn't rely on intelligence briefings about American capabilities being accurate. The American force was adapting in real time, and German tactics needed to account for that adaptability. By spring 1944, several factors were reducing the quarter modification's prevalence. First, improved escort coverage meant bombers faced fewer prolonged defensive engagements. P-51 Mustangs, with their exceptional range and performance, could accompany bombers throughout most of their mission profiles. German fighters, forced to fight through escort screens, had fewer opportunities for uncontested attacks on bomber formations. Second, the Luftwaffe's fighter force was being systematically degraded. Losses of experienced pilots, fuel shortages, and disruption of training programs meant German interceptors were becoming less effective even when they could reach bomber formations. The defensive armament's enhanced rate of fire mattered less when facing less capable opposition. Third, some bomb groups received factory-upgraded weapons with improved buffer systems that provided better performance without unauthorized modification. These updates, while not matching the quarter modification's cyclic rate, closed the gap sufficiently that the modification's advantage diminished. Finally, the cumulative wear on modified weapons began manifesting. Barrels showed accelerated erosion. Buffer systems developed mechanical issues. Maintenance requirements increased. Some groups concluded the modification's benefits no longer justified the maintenance burden and reverted to standard configuration. By summer 1944, with the invasion of Normandy underway and Allied air superiority largely established over Western Europe, the tactical conditions that had spawned the quarter modification were changing fundamentally. The desperate defensive battles over Germany in 1943 gave way to air operations supporting ground forces, where bomber gunners' primary threats came from flak rather than fighters. Staff Sergeant Russo completed his 25-mission tour in April 1944. His modified guns had functioned throughout without catastrophic failure, though they showed significant wear. In his after-action interviews, he attributed his survival partly to the enhanced firepower, partly to luck, and partly to the skill of his fellow crew members and escorting fighters. When asked whether the modification had been worth the risks, he was characteristically pragmatic. It worked for me, might not work for someone else. Every man had to make his own calculation. That individualized risk assessment characterized the entire quarter modification phenomenon. It wasn't a universal solution or a game-changing innovation. It was a marginal improvement that some crews found valuable and others didn't. Its significance lay less in its technical merits than in what it represented: the willingness of combat personnel to adapt their equipment to match operational requirements, even at personal risk and in violation of regulations. Post-war analysis of the modification reached mixed conclusions. Army Air Force Ordnance studies concluded the practice had been potentially dangerous, but probably not significantly harmful to overall mission success or failure. The increased rate of fire provided marginal benefit in specific scenarios, but wasn't decisive in determining air campaign outcomes. Recommendations suggested that future weapon designs should incorporate provisions for field modifications within controlled parameters, acknowledging that frontline personnel will inevitably adapt equipment to perceived needs. The Browning 50 caliber machine gun itself continued serving for decades after World War II. The same basic design, with various modifications and improvements, equipped American aircraft through the Korean War and into the jet age. But the quarter modification didn't survive into these later conflicts. Improved ammunition, better gun sights, and jet-age engagement geometries made the World War II-era improvisation obsolete. In late 1946, with the war over and peacetime maintenance standards reimposed, a comprehensive inspection of mothballed B-17 and B-24 bombers revealed that approximately 30 to 40% showed evidence of the quarter modification. Some aircraft had modified all defensive positions. Others showed modification only of waist or tail positions. The variation reflected the decentralized, informal nature of the practice. The quarters themselves, thousands of dollars worth of United States currency, were collected during post-war weapons refurbishment and turned over to finance officers. Some were returned to circulation. Others, too worn or damaged from repeated high-impact buffering, were destroyed. A small number were kept as souvenirs by veterans who wanted physical reminders of their improvised innovation. Master Sergeant William Fletcher retired from the Army Air Force in 1947. In a recorded oral history interview conducted in 1982, he was asked about the quarter modification. His response reflected the ambiguity that surrounded the practice even decades later. "I knew about it, saw it done, knew it was against regulations, but I also knew boys were getting shot at, and if they thought it helped them, who was I to tell them no?" Official policy said one thing, combat said another. I lived in the gap between those two realities. The gap between official policy and combat reality exists in every military organization during wartime. How that gap is managed, whether through rigid enforcement, pragmatic accommodation, or something in between, can affect both operational effectiveness and morale. The quarter modification represented a test case in institutional flexibility, demonstrating that sometimes the best response to unauthorized innovation is neither endorsement nor prohibition, but rather informed toleration with appropriate monitoring. Modern weapon systems, with their sophisticated electronics and precision-machined components, generally don't permit such simple field modifications. The 50 caliber Browning was mechanically simple enough that replacing buffer discs with coins could enhance performance. Contemporary weapons, operating at much higher performance thresholds with tighter tolerances, lack that modification potential. This increased sophistication brings improved baseline performance, but reduced adaptability. Whether this represents progress or constraint depends on perspective. Optimized weapons that operate at peak efficiency without requiring field modification are clearly preferable. But the capacity for adaptation, even crude adaptation, provided flexibility that might prove valuable when circumstances deviate from design assumptions. The quarter modification occupies a small footnote in the vast history of World War II aerial combat. It wasn't decisive. It didn't change strategic outcomes. Most historians of the air war never mention it, but for the men who used it, who believed it gave them an edge during desperate moments thousands of feet above enemy territory, it mattered intensely and personally. Technical Sergeant James Patterson, whose modified guns had engaged the Bf-109 over Wilhelmshaven, was killed in action during a raid on Berlin in March 1944. His modified guns were recovered from the wreckage of his B-17. Examination showed they had been fired extensively during the final engagement. Whether increased rate of fire made any difference in that doomed aircraft's last moments is unknowable. Patterson had believed it would. That belief had been sufficient. Staff Sergeant Russo returned to civilian life in Brooklyn, New York, working as a machinist in a tool and die shop. He never spoke extensively about his combat experiences, typical of his generation. But he kept one artifact from his service, a single quarter, worn smooth on one side from its service as an improvised gun part. The coin sat on his workbench for 40 years, a tangible reminder of the ingenuity born from necessity, the desperation that drove men to modify their weapons with pocket change, and the thin margin between survival and death in the skies over Europe. The quarter modification represented everything contradictory about war: pragmatism and recklessness, innovation and violation, courage and desperation intertwined inseparably. It was simultaneously brilliant improvisation and dangerous foolishness. It violated regulations while potentially saving lives. It was officially banned and unofficially tolerated. It made almost no measurable difference in the war's outcome and yet mattered profoundly to the individuals who used it. In late 1943, when the outcome of the air war over Europe remained uncertain, and B-17 seconds flew their missions through skies filled with enemy fighters, a simple modification using everyday pocket change gave some men the feeling, whether justified or not, that they possessed slightly better odds of survival. In combat, perception often matters as much as reality. The psychological boost from believing you have an edge, even a marginal edge, can influence performance and decision-making in critical moments. Did the quarter modification actually make 50 caliber machine guns more effective at penetrating German armor at 800 yards? The technical answer is complex. At that range, penetration depended heavily on target type, armor thickness, impact angle, and ammunition type. Lightly armored vehicles with 8 to 14 mm plates could potentially be penetrated under Raffelati, ideal conditions. Heavier armor was effectively immune. The increased rate of fire provided more opportunities for hits, but didn't fundamentally alter the round's penetration capability, which was determined by projectile velocity, mass, and construction. The psychological answer is simpler. German vehicle crews and pilots, perceiving heavier defensive fire, often reacted by taking evasive action, breaking off attacks, or seeking cover. Whether the rounds would have actually penetrated their armor became irrelevant if the defensive fire convinced them to disengage. In this sense, the modification's effectiveness lay not in physics, but in psychology, the ability to project sufficient threat to influence enemy behavior. The historical legacy of the quarter modification extends beyond its specific technical merits or combat effectiveness. It demonstrated that military organizations, despite their emphasis on standardization and regulatory compliance, possess remarkable capacity for adaptive innovation when frontline personnel perceive operational needs that official doctrine doesn't address. This capacity, sometimes called directed opportunism by military theorists, represents a crucial advantage in dynamic combat environments where enemy tactics evolve faster than formal doctrine can adapt. The American military's culture, which generally permits greater initiative at lower levels compared to more rigidly hierarchical forces, created an environment where such modifications could emerge and proliferate. The fact that commanders didn't aggressively suppress the practice, despite its violation of regulations, reflected an institutional understanding that combat effectiveness sometimes requires accepting practices that wouldn't be tolerated in peacetime. This cultural dimension, the willingness to permit battlefield improvisation within certain boundaries, contributed significantly to American military effectiveness during World War II. From the quarter modification to tank crews, welding additional armor to aircraft crews, developing new tactical formations, the pattern repeated. Frontline personnel identified problems, developed solutions, and implemented them with varying degrees of official blessing. The system's flexibility allowed rapid adaptation while maintaining enough structure to prevent chaos. The story of the quarter modification thus becomes more than an anecdote about bomber gunners and pocket change. It becomes an illustration of how large organizations can, when circumstances demand balance, competing imperatives of standardization and innovation, control and flexibility, regulation and pragmatism. That balance is never perfect, never without tension, but when achieved effectively, it provides operational advantage that purely rigid systems cannot match. As the last combat veterans of World War II pass from living memory, artifacts and stories like the quarter modification take on increased significance. They provide concrete connections to the human experience of war, not the grand strategic narratives or major campaign histories, but the small, personal adaptations that individuals made in pursuit of survival. These details remind us that history consists not just of battles and decisions, but of countless individual choices, risks, and innovations, most of which vanish without record. The quarters themselves, those worn silver coins that spent months or years absorbing the impact of recoiling gun bolts thousands of feet above Europe, are today scattered in private collections or lost to history. A few reside in Air Force museums, displayed alongside other armament artifacts, but rarely with specific explanation of their unconventional use. To most museum visitors, they're just coins. To those who know their history, they represent something more, a tangible reminder that desperate circumstances can inspire ingenious solutions, that regulations are sometimes obstacles to survival, and that the margin between life and death can be measured in quarters, both the monetary and time varieties. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.